All right, so I'm going to turn this over now. I'm going to take the screen and then share my mouse with Chris McMurray so that he can walk us all through what's happening with the EduJedi and all of their work. I'll pipe up towards the end, Chris, about the latest from the EduJedi.
Sounds good.
Yeah,
Sounds good.
but I'm going to give you mouse control because I know
Thank you.
like that. Yeah,
we all love mouse control. I mean,
yeah.
that's the thing we all strive for. At least I do, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, there you go. Now I'm going to turn my video off, and it's going to be just all about you for right now.
Awesome. Thanks. Happy Wednesday, folks.
Yeah.
So yeah, my name is Chris McMurray. You know, I'm one of the EduJedi leadership folks, and have been doing this work for a lot of years and working with a lot of smart people. Luckily, that are helping to evolve this thing that we called education and that business. And so, it's all necessary and worthy work. Listening to that last group share, these are the things we're all working toward, right? And we got to work together. So, what I want to share today is some information about some standards and some responsibilities that are sort of shifting and evolving as we start to move more explicitly toward actually implementing some of this stuff. And I've been a chief academic officer. I started in the classroom and I loved it, and I was an instructional coach and have been using technology since the early MacBook days. And before that in the classroom, and what we get to appreciate now is a place where we've learned a whole lot, right? And we've come so far, and we've moved really fast. And some of it was a necessity, and some of it was seen as what might be called an initiative. And that's sometimes used as a bad word and it's thrown around, but here we are, right? And so what we're talking about today is really, how do we think about this, the move beyond basic digital literacy into a digital learning experience, right? And how does an end user or a learner leverage the design that has been created with and for them, using tools that are now available that weren't available before, because previously it was all very relatively clumsy, and you were sort of patching things together and used a lot of gum and some duct tape and cross your fingers that the technology is going to work. But now it's pretty seamless, right? The technology is there. It's like air. You don't really think that much about it, and yet what's evolving as the normal in our educational system is really requiring some thinking about responsibilities and about things that leaders within that system, including teachers, right, and including the learners as well, some responsibilities that exist and have evolved as we've sort of brought these things together. So what I'm going to share with you today is really some of that information, but what I want to do is step back just a little bit and lend some context for this, because we're going to look at some experience standards and some standards for administrators, some standards for teachers, some standards for learners. And these are all resident in the EduJedi dictionary. For sure, download that. Absolutely. If you don't already have it, go get it. And I'm going to be referring to some of that stuff today. But I want to the context that I want to create for our next section of this conversation is really why this is important, right? And so a lot of folks say, oh my gosh, another standard set, another set of rules, another set of things. It's a litmus, it's a whatever, it's a checklist. And yet, in sort of the evolving needs for leveraging technology and meeting learners' needs and personalizing and all of those things that are positive and worthy, having a guide is really necessary. I would have loved to have had something like that as a young administrator, as a chief academic officer, sort of getting into this digital transformation with my partners in crime. Would have loved to have had some of this information back then, and it was just sort of coming out. We were just developing it, and so now we're at a point where we can say, yeah, there's actually a number of things. We can enumerate them, a number of things that a chief academic officer needs to know, and the executive level of your district needs to know, and your building principals need to know, and your teacher leaders need to know, and your instructional coaches need to know, and all of those things are going to to sort of tie together. So if we jump ahead to things like the standards, for example, the first standard for administrators is that the institution conducts routine inventory of all knowledge objects. Well, great, right? That's actually something necessary. Well, in order to do that, what information do you have to have in order to actually do that? Because if that's important, and it is, then having common vocabulary is very critical. Understanding what a knowledge object is very critical. Understanding how to select a knowledge object is critical. How to select it for personalized learning and learning design is important. And then having common vocabulary, right? We have to have a common vocabulary. Otherwise, as we all know, any of us working through change, that is all of us, know that having a common vocab is very important as we move systems forward. So I'm going to jump ahead then to this digital curriculum characteristics scale. And what I want to highlight here is that this talks directly to standards 1, 2, and 3, right? And we're starting to dig in, and I'm going to start at the beginning there. So this is how do you identify, right? How do you identify and start to qualify a learning object? And so this was developed early on by the EduJedi and the Learning Council in conjunction with a lot of great educators in the country. And what you see here is a scale of sophistication, essentially. And so you're taking a look at the range of digital learning objects that are out there, knowledge objects. And on the very far left side, you see the digital document level. That's kind of the lowest level of sophistication. That's like a Google Doc. It's like a Word doc. It doesn't really do anything. It can impart some information, and you can sort of search it for certain words. You can read it for meaning and things like that, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't interact necessarily. It's just a thing, and it's a bit, right? It's the smallest bit. It's the disaggregation. And then you move up into single loop animations, and as we move up that scale, right up into single loop animations, that's like things flying in from the left on a slide deck, or it's things dissolving in, or things like that are very simple, very rudimentary. They lend a little bit of interest, but they don't really do much. They're not connected to much of anything else, and it's fairly low sophistication. And then you move into video, and so video is interesting because the video level is actually the first time where the end user actually has some ability to modulate within their experience. And so this might be a video that the teacher has created around a content set or something like that. And all of a sudden the user can, just like on YouTube, right? They can, if they're learning how to, they're in high school, they're learning how to change a tire, right? Hit YouTube. So you can start fast forwarding, you can pause, you can rewatch, you can stop, you can digest at your own pace. And you have some control. You're starting to be able to exercise some agency, and that's awesome, right? That's what we're all aiming for. We're all aiming for student agency and learner agency. And so if you take that line and you think, all right, anything from video down to digital document, those are all very discrete pieces, and they don't really connect necessarily to other things. They're also really labor intensive. And so either you're creating that digital document or you're compiling it from a number of other things, but you're still creating all of those things, and you're the center point of that as the teacher or as the designer, and that causes a load, right? And we're going to talk about load a little bit later. But what we want to be able to do, and you can see the arrows at the top, we want to be able to start using objects that are going to take the load off rather than add load. And that's critical. That's really, really important, because what we're asking our teachers to do today is different. It's all very relative and relevant to the center, which is a learner-centered experience, and that hasn't changed, right? The need for that is still the same, but we can make it a lot easier. So we move up into the collections level, and for example, that would be I've now gone out and contextualized a whole bunch of information around maybe a range of topics and content areas, and it's searchable and it's aligned to standards, and so all of a sudden now I can move within that, and as a designer of a learning experience, I can start selecting pieces within those collections and pointing to them and linking them together. And that's way better as a user, as an end user. Love that, right? Because I can move around it. I can start to find the pieces that are meaningful to me, use those, bypass some that are not. And as a designer, I can start pointing people to certain stuff. So that's a very distinct line, because as soon as you move past that into the feedback level, objects actually do a bunch of those things that are in the higher end of the collection side, but they also start to answer questions, and they start to provide feedback to the end user based on input, and they start to interact with the user in a way that can actually take load off of the teacher, because then all of a sudden you're not having to be side by side with every student in your classroom as they go through this experience. You're moving around, right? And you're learning the learner, because that's your job number one. And you're allowing the technology to start to take some of that off of your shoulders. And that's good. So we refer to that, and you'll see it in the dictionary and referenced in the standards as a learning ability within the object, the knowledge object, or the resource. And so that's a critical departure, because now all of a sudden we're tipping over into more automated learning, and we're allowing the machines to do what machines do really well, and we're maximizing or amplifying the humans in the equation. And that's like a win. That's a win for everybody. We've used the resource. We're leveraging the thing that the humans do really well, and we're building relationships. We're attending to all the SEL components that are critically important, and we're allowing the technology to do what it's intended to do. So we move up into coding. This is more like sort of the low level coding, right? This is AM coding, not pro coding. And this would be like a website that is created by a teacher, which is still really cool and very sophisticated, and some work, right? You have to have some knowledge and some skill and some training to do that. But this then creates a much richer environment for the learner to be immersed in. And that's really good. That sophistication is allowing the experience to be that much better. And we know that that's going to result in some increases in engagement and all the things that are going to lead to some sticky learning. And then we hop up into the top of that scale, which is the designed digital courseware, right? This is where the pros are creating worlds, and these are resources that have a range of content areas. They have characteristics like gating and things like that we'll talk about and define in just a minute. But all of those features that allow a user or a learner to enter into that experience and move around in it at their own pace and find the things that they really need. So that's important, because as you start to take inventory of your knowledge objects, you have to be able to say, all right, well, if I was going to use these standards as a lens, which you can and should, what would it look like for me to measure up my inventory of stuff that I have in the ecosystem against that, and where along that spectrum are the predominance of my resources, and am I actually helping my teachers as designers to design sophisticated and engaging experiences using something at the top of that scale? And that's important. And if you don't know how to identify those, then that inventory, it's incomplete, right? It's incomplete, and it's not going to act the way that it should. It's not going to be as helpful. You'll just know kind of the names of the things that you have, but not necessarily how they're good or be able to evaluate them. So that's important information. The next scale that I'm going to share with you is actually not new. It shows up in a report it's thumbnailed there. Report that was released by the Learning Council, and this is actually how you evaluate them. This particular scale relates directly to one of the standards, and this is Standard 11 for administrators. And this is important, because this is how you start to say, okay, we can identify the type of object, because we looked at the last scale. Now we want to be able to say, how good are those things? And how do we know that they are the completeness of those things? And how do we know the contextualization of those things? And if you see this particular graphic has a top and a bottom, the top is essentially the amateur authorware type of a level, and then the bottom is more professionally coded. So you can imagine that the orange box at the top lives closer to the bottom side of that previous scale that we looked at. the long and short form of the professionally coded lives at the top end of that scale. So looking through this, we see the concept level, for example, is very granular. It's tiny. It's really, it's just a bit of information. It doesn't really have any connectivity. It doesn't do anything. And so then again, how much work are we causing, right? What is there a load that goes along with this? And if I'm selecting a learning object or a knowledge object that lives down in that concept level, how effective is that going to be as a Lego piece, right? If I'm designing and we use that analogy, how effective is that? Moving up to contextualization, right? These are the bits that are now connected and are starting to help the user make meaning. Up until we get to sort of the courses and ebook level, which are examples of that sort of authorware. And so those ebooks, right? That's even me, right? Even I can make an ebook, and I can load it full of a bunch of stuff, and I can link to some things. And there's courses out there that are course level resources that are actually super effective. They're very effective. And this is an aggregation of information and content. So we take a look from there into the professionally coded world, which has a very similar type of a disaggregated or granular to aggregated type of a scale. And we take a look at the app level in relation to the concept level. And that applet or app level is just a single app, right? This is my math facts app, or a spelling app, or a discrete skill app. And it doesn't live within a system. It doesn't interact with any of the other things that are in the ecosystem. And it does its job probably really well, but it doesn't really help you to make connections. It doesn't smooth the road. It just does what it does. And you can't really build a full experience with that. You have to have something more. It's necessary. And so we move into things like the course and the courseware levels. And now we're starting to really talk about at the top of this scale about AI and right, we're using predictive models, and we've got some different types of engines that are helping the experience to be much more rich. And we're talking about VR, right? Any of the machine learning aspects. If you think of our previous slide, that feedback level is built into those, right? So you're interacting as an end user, you're interacting, and UX user experience is huge for those resource developers, and as it should be, right? Because we're then saying that level of a resource, a knowledge object, if you as a learning designer use that, you are going to be building a very rich experience. And so I'm sharing this because it relates directly to the standards for administrators and teachers. And it's important then to be able to say, okay, yeah, I can now evaluate, and I can identify them. Now I can evaluate them, and I can say which ones are better and more well suited for the type of a task that we're talking about doing. So that's important information to carry with you as we go into the rest of our conversation today. The next thing that I want to share, and in terms of an ecosystem, the last two scales really talked about what, and they talked about quality, right, and sort of the characteristics of the objects, and the next thing that you'll want to be aware of as an administrator or as a leader of learning within a system is view of and mindfulness of the entirety of the system, right? And so what you see here is sort of a very simplistic look at all of the things. And I was a chief academic officer, and a good friend of mine was the CIO, and so we would sort of sit around and get geeky on how gigantic the machine was. And when you start thinking about all of the bits and pieces and the little cogs and wheels and things that click and tick and have to interconnect and have to do all of the right things at the right time in order for the thing to work, in order for learning to occur and be designed, it's mind-boggling, right? It's huge. It's gigantic. It just is. And we probably haven't made it easier. We've tossed in a whole bunch of stuff, and people have been buying like mad. and dumping it into whatever system they have, and whether they have something like ClassLink, which gives you a dashboard. If they don't have that, right, then it's nuts, right? And so on this particular graphic, you can see all of the things. We've got layers of technology and resources in here. We've got scheduling platforms. We've got asset management. We've got portal types of resources and things like that. Any types of security types of things. All the data warehousing, all of the back end stuff, right, is all in there. And then on top of that, we've got some software systems that are like your SIS, right? Your SIS, if you've got an LMS, any of your PD, any of your facilities management systems, any of your fiscal stuff, all your HR things, all of those other systems that are kind of the back end of the real act or the real work, which is teaching and learning. All of those things exist, and people within the system have to have some proficiency with those. And then on top of that, you have what you see as sort of the stair-stepped type of a graphic right there. And this is all the stuff that these are the Lego blocks that the learning designers are using to create the experience, and the end users and the learners themselves are using these things, and that's daunting, right? I mean, there's maybe 4 in each of those grade levels that's depicted there, but we know, right? We've all seen our systems, and if you're a chief academic officer or a CNI, you know all the stuff, right? You know all the stuff that's out there swirling around, and hopefully it's not changing by grade level, and hopefully it's not changing by classroom within a grade level, or even by building within a system. And yet we also know that that's a reality, and there's more stuff out there than any of us would have ever imagined would be appropriate and manageable. And that then is a description of a load, right? So there's a digital load that I just described, and that's something that we created. We created a digital load, and then we said, okay, educators, here you go, and now go do great things. And so this representation and the acknowledgement that there's a digital load is relatively new. It's something that the Learning Council recognized in many conversations with educators. And I remember myself, as a classroom teacher, moving into digital, we all experienced something that we couldn't articulate. And we knew that there was more. We couldn't really identify it because we didn't have a great way to start to think about knowledge objects. We didn't have a map. We didn't have a global view of all the things within the system and how it impacts the end user, which is the learner. But also then our learning designers. And so one of the learning the standards for leaders within the system is having that, right? Have a map, have a graphic representation of what you've got in the system and what it does. And as you start to evaluate, you're going to be surprised. I've talked to colleagues in other systems, and when they start to actually write down and document all the things, it's a mind blower, right? It fills a whiteboard 3 times over. And then if you think of trying to meet individual students' needs within that swirl, that's nuts. That can create some anxiety, right? And that's where people start checking out. And so what's missing in all of that, right? It's not that it's bad to have all those things. It's actually quite necessary. You do have to evaluate them. You do have to start to winnow down and start to say which ones are more effective and which ones are not effective at all, and which ones do we continue, and which ones do we have to jettison and get different for. But what's truly missing within all of that is a logistics layer, right? And so getting around and navigating and sort of coexisting within that ecosystem requires that you start to use some things like auto cohorting, and you start to think about some distributive models, and you start to think about calendaring and scheduling, and then lo and behold, machines do that really well. And so that's one of the things that we're talking with districts about. We're saying, okay, it's great that you have these things. You've built a fantastic foundation. Now what? And now how do you help learners move through and with all of those things? And how do you help designers to design with solid tools that are really designed to enhance and amplify the humanity and the thinking, and then really start to move that through. So that's the hybrid model architecture for personalized learning, which is the thing that we're going to, right? Which oddly enough is also a standard, right? And so all of the things that we're talking about here today that I'm giving you some context and background on relate very directly back to a standard and give that standard some meat and some foundational knowledge. And so as we get a little bit further into this and start looking at the dictionary, you're going to notice that there are definitions and vocabulary that ties directly to those standards, and you have to have those pieces in your collection of information as you start to dig into the standards and start to say, all right, now how do I actually know if a learning object or a knowledge object is aligned to academic standards or goals? How do I know that, right? It's your responsibility. You do actually have to know that. And whether you have a full C&I team, or whether that C&I team is just you and you're one chief academic officer in a small system, you still have the same responsibility, right? Because the task is the same, and we're all about the experience for the students and teachers. So I share that with you not to dissuade you or to cause dismay, but to simply highlight the need for having a map, right? It's in standard number 3. We're sort of going through this thing as sort of chronologically in terms of the basis of importance and how we sort of layer on responsibility and layer on knowledge. And so this is it. It's quite literally that the institution constructs a model or graphic of their system, right? And here we go. So all of the things that go into your system, what does your ecosystem look like? And let's do that. And I would add, you need to have more than just the IT department do that. That actually has to be done hand in hand with teaching and learning, because it's a dual job. And in fact, it should also have a third person involved, and that is the fiscal leader. So if your CFO is not in the room, engage them, get them in there. And what better way to do that than with some common vocab and some common understanding around these models and the standards. So that's important. So I'm gonna actually jump into very briefly into the dictionary, because I want to show you some of the functions and features of that and how they will help as you start digging into these standards. It's, if you haven't seen it, it's organized very simply into 9 categories. Those 9 categories are self-explanatory here. And so it really starts to talk about characteristics of learning objects or knowledge objects, and then things that you need to understand and know as you start to evaluate and select those. And that relates back to the previous stuff that I just shared with you, because, for example, business model shows up. It's in one of the standards. One of the things that you have a responsibility to do is understand the business model of the resources that you're speccing. And I talk to professionals across the country all the time about how do you select things, right? And how do you as an executive level leader within a school system, how do you know what to pick and what not to pick? And the business model is one of those, right? It includes information like the legal aspects of the contract. You do have to know that. That's not something you get to pass off to legal. You actually need to understand that. And even as a teacher, you have to understand the business model. You have to understand hostile characteristics. So this is a good example of what some of the definitions are. You can see that it's sort of written in English, and then it also has some more in-depth types of information in here. This is great because for me, to go, oh, trigger procedure, yeah, sure, exactly, I know what that is, and then being able to have that same conversation with my compatriot in IT who knows exactly what that is. They know how it happens, and I know why it happens. And so that creates sort of an awesome Oreo cookie type of a relationship. And then all of a sudden we're high-fiving, because not only do both of us now know why and how, it's now that we have a common understanding, and we've shared that more broadly than just the two of us. So gating, again, another great example. This is a fantastic opportunity to talk about personalization, because this is a function of resources that are much higher on the sophistication level, that can allow a learner to either progress at their own pace by taking a ceiling off, or by placing in a ceiling, so that learning can progress, but at a much more controlled pace. And so knowing things like this, knowing whether your resources are using gating or have variable gating, or can you turn the gating on and off, that's important to know, and that's for sure something that you want to understand clearly. Another great example, hostile characteristics. We know all of those things. Modals, it goes through any number of additional definitions. This is a good one. Nesting, great example, because guess what shows up in the standards? Systems for information storage, documentation, and access, right? Bing, it's talking about nesting. And let's just use the term, right? Let's not make up a word for it. Here's a word that talks directly about that. And as a learner, you'll see in the standards when you look at them, as a learner, how are you organizing your information, right? How are resources that you're speccing as the C&I professional, how are resources that you're speccing nesting information? Is it easy to use? Because if it's not going to be used. That's a guarantee. If a resource is too difficult, it gets pushed over. We don't have time for that. We just don't. And so this is good information to have. So I'm going to hop into the standards very quickly. And so all of that information that I shared previously is really sort of leading up to some of these standards. When you look at the standards, the standards for school administrators are really talking about the evolution of our responsibility as professionals. A lot of this stuff, if not all of it, was not in admin school. It wasn't. And so a lot of people have learned in sort of a trial by fire manner, and that's fine. And we learn from colleagues, and we listen a lot, and we watch, and thankfully we're in a profession that really allows us to share and encourages collaboration, and that's really fantastic, because what we're now talking about is things that you need to know as an administrator in a number of levels within a system, and those are directly relative to management of digital resources and systems, and then how those impact the experience of learners and how they impact the design of that experience. And so there's a number of them. This is an evolving set of tools, and so the purpose of this is really to help systems, to help our school systems to go from we are now talking about needing to do this thing, right, and needing to plan learning experiences, which is different than planning teaching. We now have a responsibility to understand a new range of sort of information and tools. So, for example, we have some standards for administrators that are. Where's my mouse control? There we go. So this is just 3, right? And so this is 3 of the standards for administrators that sort of are relative to things that we talked about. The first bullet there is really sort of talking about business model, right? It's talking about all the legal aspects. It's talking about data ownership. All of those things are critically important that you understand and can articulate, because you have to plan around those things. And that's not a surprise, right? A DSA, we've all dealt with them, right? By now, everyone knows what DSA means, and most people have a DSA, and we've been around been around the block with some stuff like that. And there was a time I remember very not that long ago when a common DSA was not around. We didn't have a basis for a common DSA, and our resource providers were working really hard to get up to speed and to help us as educators to do the right thing and understand that. And there was a lot of headbutting around that, and we came to the other side, and now, we've got some great examples out there. But that's something that you have to understand. As you look at the standards, we have 20 plus standards within there, and the grouping of those is progressive. So when you look at those, what you'll see is that the first third of those, essentially, or so, almost the first 10, really talk about the tools, right? And it talks about the knowledge objects. It talks about the system, sort of that back end side of things. It talks about how you're modeling all of those things, and actually then evaluating and selecting and all of those things, aligning those to academic standards. Those are all in the top half of that standard set. As you go beyond that, what we're then talking about is designing the experience. And so we're starting to talk about things like the knowledge object causing learning or delivering content in a certain way. We're talking about the knowledge objects being considered or evaluated for completeness of knowledge content covered, right? And so we're talking about scope, and we're talking about sequence within there. And you can tell then, as you read through those standards, that you're getting closer and closer and closer to the actual experience of the user. And that's not a mistake, right? That's not perchance. That's because at the beginning of this, you have to be able to understand how to select and see and evaluate all of those, and then start building the system up from there, right? Because as you think about professional learning, we already have to have a set of things built up. We have to set a floor, and then be able to teach up from that floor, and then continue to move the learning from that point. The last sort of segment of the standards for the administrators and for teachers, and you'll see those, these are all now starting to talk about program. And of course, we're getting closer and closer to the end experience, the user experience. And so we're talking about the impact of characteristics. We're talking about the institution moving toward digital pathways, right, for end-to-end experiences. We're talking about course building workflow, right? And so that word workflow is worth highlighting. That's one of those that you want to highlight that in yellow, and if you can make it blink, do so, because the workflow is going to be the difference between planning for teaching and designing for learning. And that's when we talked about logistics, that's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. And we see it in classrooms now, right? And school buildings now, where they've taken the old schedule, they did this and went, and what they put in is much more flexible. And now all of a sudden we're talking about facilities management, reading the third teacher, and understanding how a building can help to increase learning, right? And so all of those things are going to be relative to workflow, because it's not just this anymore, right? It's mind mappy. And so since you are then moving around, right, how are you going to make sure that that experience is actually moving toward that workflow, but then also moving toward personalization, right? And that's the other bullet that's on the example here. But one of the standards is that the institution is working progressively toward that personalized learning experience, and it's not optional, right? And so you either are doing that or you're not, and if you're not, then you're behind. And it's now time to start doing that. And we've got a ton of models. We've got everybody who's been sharing examples on this particular in this particular session is talking about a personalized learning experience. They're doing that. There's folks doing it, and they're doing it successfully. You don't have to make it up. You can go steal some ideas, because there's a ton of great ideas out there. Happily, happily we can share a lot of those things. So it's a lot to think about, right? We're in the beginning of helping people to implement these things, and we're going to continue to evolve that. But just at the top, right? At the top, the standards for administrators start there, right? One of the things that is interesting to have conversations about with systems is, and it's always a question that comes up, where is your executive level with this learning? And are they learning with you, and have they taken a learner stance? And who, which of those levels of administration in the executive, how well can they articulate this, and how well can they start to think about how what is their part of this particular transformation, and start to own that. Well, how does facilities engage? How does fiscal engage? How does IT engage? All of those things, all of those little bits and pieces of the system that are required. So I'm going to move on to some standards for teachers, because there's a slight difference here. So these are all relatively progressive, and as you look at the standards, the responsibilities again go sort of from macro to micro, and we're going from sort of some technical aspects of things. Of the job and the task and the items, down to sort of the on the street, in the classroom, the building of the experience levels. And so the standards for teachers really talk about knowledge objects again. However, it's talking about composition within systems. It's talking about learning design, and it's talking about student oversight, essentially. And within that student oversight comes the idea of workflow, and that then ties to the learning design, which then ties to what are you using, what are the tools that you're using to design those experiences. So we're talking about curating and using knowledge objects. We're talking about identifying. Again, you've got to be able to identify which ones are good. So you better have those two scales in your mind, because you're going to need to pick some resources that are going to be most effective and are going to give you the most leverage and maximize your time and amplify your ability as a connection maker and a relationship builder with those learners. So that's important, right? And we're talking about using inquiry, right? So in a very similar way that the administrative standards are organized, the first section of them is talking about the stuff, about the knowledge objects and the resources, and then we're talking about design of the experience. And so one of the terms in here is small group, whole group. We're talking about PBL. We're talking about some of the interactive aspects. But what's important about that, and you'll see it in the model that I'm going to share in just a minute, you'll see that all of those things are building tools, right? And that's all stuff that you start to build with. And so similar, we're talking about designing the experience, and then in the last sort of section of those standards, we're now talking about workflow, and we're talking about program, right? We're talking about where do we put inquiry? How do we trigger things? How do we trigger a learner to go from a digital platform into an experiential or hands-on activity? And then how do you do that? And where do you place human intersections and things like that? So that's, again, it's a slightly different set. None of it's actually new, right? I mean, a lot of these ideas have been around, and it's really just articulating it, and then it's planning with it and being explicit with it, and just doing it rather than just nodding about it. And that's an important distinction to make. So the student standards are also sort of progressive, right? So this is now talking about, when we talk about the standards for students, we're saying there are a number of things that you as a learner, and adults also, you as a learner need to be able to do, and things that you need to know that are relative to using a system and working with a system. And so we all know that we lead and we design experiences for learners that are going to increase student agency and build learner identity, so that students have ownership of their path, right? And that's how we we ideally are learning or are designing learning experiences. So the standards for learners are similar, right? They're going to start with sort of the thing, right? The stuff level. And so how are you identifying what of those resources work best for you? You have a responsibility to do that. And then we're going to talk about how you use those, right? We're going to start thinking, okay, how do I use those to help my experience? And then we're going to start talking about program types of things and evaluation. So as a student, right, the sort of myth about digital natives, there's a great number of things that knowledge of a device doesn't really help you with, right? And so being able to increase agency to such a level that a learner can evaluate a tool on its effectiveness for them, that doesn't come naturally. That's something you're going to have to teach. So these standards for learners are for sure something to build into the scope and sequence for your year. And as a building and as a district, where do you put that, right? Where do you put that? And how do you create a progression of those skills in a similar way that, right, there's a number of other standard sets that sort of talk about digital literacy in a slightly different way, but that have kind of a progression built in. And how will you then take these and layer that into some of the progressions and systems that you and processes that you already have set up? And so that's how these standards for students are organized, right? So taking responsibility for materials, right? You're mastering methods of showing proof. So you have facility with a number of tools that allow you to show what you know. And so that's all important. And it's going to be different from K to 1 to 5 to 6 to 9 to 12. And so those are all things that even, you know, as a teacher, of course you're gonna look at these because this is the thing that you want your students to do. So we mentioned tagging. That shows up for students too, keeping your digital items, your knowledge objects, organized in folders or in tags, or however it is that you're gonna help yourself with easy recovery and sharing, because now that's what we're talking about. We're no longer talking about shuffling paper, and so that's an important distinction to make. All of these tie up to and are sort of dovetailed with another conversation around UI design and UX, and all of those things are the real technical aspects, right? What we've just been talking about in terms of standards for students, teachers, and administrators is sort of, once all of the technology is working and it works well, what is the experience going to be floating on top of that? My counterpart in IT used to say that when he was talking to his folks, he used to say, you know, our job is really to make teaching and learning look good. And I always appreciated that because that meant that they had an eye on teaching and learning as much as we did. And they knew that for example, something like a 404 page not found error, we might not really know much about that on the back end, but we for sure know what it feels like on the top end. And we know that if we get 404 page not found errors, that's going to kill an experience, and that's where we want to start working together. So so this is also included. All of those UX and UI issues and definitions are all included in that dictionary, and they're tied to those standards, because we know that all of those things have to coexist and sort of go together into what we now know as our current responsibilities. So I'm gonna make a leap now, and taking all of that information, I'm gonna start a conversation with you a little bit about this model that we have. And so as you start to consider the difference between planning for teaching and designing for learning, having a model is important. Having things like common definitions is important. Having those identification and evaluation skills, all super important. All of those are important, but when it comes time to actually design, And you're the teacher going, okay, great. So now I've got all this stuff. I know how to identify high quality learning objects or knowledge objects. And now what do I do? How do I do that? So we took a look at some models, right? And so that was common feedback. And the EduJedi and the Learning Council really sat down and said, all right, so how can we help people to begin to design, and how can we strengthen the work of people who are already heading down that path, and how can we learn from some of those folks as well? And so what you see in front of you there on the screen is two models. There's a lot of them out there, right? This is the Addie's model, shows up here. It's whatever, 45 years old, and is not bad, right? It's not bad, except that it's teacher centric, right? And so this is fine if you're planning for teaching. If you take a look at the analysis, that first little box there on the left-hand side, you're talking about organization, you're talking about learner goals, you're talking about problem being solved. That's all teacher centric, right? That's created by the teacher. It doesn't talk about inquiry, and you could probably read that into it, possibly, but that's a stretch. And how do you replicate that? As a system, how do you make that systematic so that there's equity across your system, and create the common vocab that's going to help people? So things like content creation, right? We're up in the Addie's model. We're talking about content creation. Yikes, heavy lift, right? That's a lot of work. And, I remember back in my early days as a classroom teacher, I was lucky enough to have a fantastic team, and we planned together as a PLC. We shared planning load, and we came up with some awesome stuff. We didn't have to do all of it, but if I had to, that's yikes. That's a lot of work, right? So I'd rather move from content creation into something like curation, because that's going to be much more effective for me. So think about that teacher centric, or teacher centricity in the Addie's model, because we needed a departure. So in the EduJedi model that you see below that, there's two rows, and the model is broken up into two different design categories. And one of those is the workflow or logistics design category. And that's what you see in green. The other one is the discovery design category, and that's what you see in orange. And similar types of column headings and functions. However, you'll notice that the EduJedi model is really learner centric, and it starts to point at what the teacher should be doing. However, it's more circular, right? It's definitely much more interactive. It definitely includes the learner in that activity. So, for example, you'll see that in the scope versus analysis box there on the top left of the green in workflow is setting goals, right? You're selecting academic standards, and we all do this. That's not new, but we're starting to think about pacing guides. Where is the experience going to be within relative to the entire year's experience? Things that we need to know and be able to do. But then we move over to mapping, and so different from content creation. Now we're talking about curation. We're talking about cohorting. We're talking about onboarding. We're talking about appropriate levels and which types of experiential things are going to need to go into this map or the workflow of the thing. And then in the design section of that green category, we're talking about selection of digital tools. And this is where I'm going to want more sophisticated tools. Knowing that they're more sophisticated is going to be important. How will I know they're more sophisticated? Because I looked at those scales that we just talked about at the top of the hour. And so I want to pick those things. I want to align those to live activities. I'm starting to design a map. I'm starting to design a pathway that I know learners are going to take. And it has tendrils, and it has lateral connections. It may or may not have a ceiling. In most instances, it probably should not, because you're going to be dumping a range of learners in, and they're going to need to go at their pace and speed. And some of them are going to need to not have an artificial ceiling on that experience, because they're going to go fast, and they'll be very proficient quickly. And you'll also have people that'll need to circle back. They're going to need to come back to a couple of things and try them a couple of different ways and then move on. And so that map is sort of, if you were to close your eyes and sort of see your students moving through things, That requires a number of skills, not the very least of which is knowing your learners. And I mentioned that previously. That's your number one job as a teacher, is learning the learner, because how would you ever be able to design a pathway for them if you didn't know? So that's the design aspect, right? And then implementation, right? We're moving toward actually getting this thing off the ground and kicking it into gear. And so then under that implementation box, we're talking about sequencing, right? We're coding the experience. We're talking about courses. We're talking about quality assurance. How do we know that? What are we using as a lens to know that that portion of the experience is going to be high quality and engagement? We're going to be talking about assessment and things like that. How are we expecting learners to show what they know? And then we're going to talk about logistics in that column 5. We're talking about logistics. Now, this is the implementation of that map. And if students are expected to be moving from place to place physically within a school building and within a classroom, where in my design am I going to place human interaction or a teacher moment or a small group moment or a whole group moment or independent work on a project with a partner? Where are we going to put all that stuff, right? We know that the learning is a social act, and we also know that we have to explicitly put those things in there. This is also where we consider, how am I going to use auto calendaring, or do I have a schedule, and what tools do I have available to do that, to make that seamless? And then in column 6, we're talking about termination or continuance, and this is really the consideration of in that design. You will have some students who will reach the end of that experience, and the decision point then is, where do they go from there? Do they end and go to a different experience, or do they end that portion of it and then simply evolve into the next iteration of that and continue or deepen? Or do they have to come back? And you have to have thought about all of those other columns previous to that before you start to say, okay, now if they have to go back because they haven't showed proficiency, where are they going to go, and how do they get there? And then how do I monitor their progress toward proficiency so that they can move to the next level? The discovery design category down there in orange really follows a similar type of a structure. And so you're starting with scope, and this is where in the design we're starting to include things like inquiry, and this is where that lives. The teacher and the learner are posing questions. The learner is starting to create some connections to the standard. We're moving into mapping, and this is where the learner is actually exercising student agency. And within that map, which decisions are we providing to them so that they can own that learning. And then we're talking about the design, and this is where we're saying, okay, as a learner, what is your thesis, right? What do you think is going to happen? Any of those higher level questioning skills that we know, take cost as for example, we know that any of the higher level thinking levels are going to make the learning stickier, and they also then strengthen agency, and that's important. That's critically important, especially as we use technology, because it can help. Right, and then we move into column 4, which is the implementation. This is how do we use iterative thinking, and how do we help learners to start to try things. Right, risk taking is one of those skills that students have to have in order to continue to fail forward in a positive way. All of those trials and things that they're going to have to go through within the experience are going to help them learn. And how do they refine their thinking, right? And how do we clear misconceptions? All of that stuff is included in there. And then, again, similar to the top column or band rather, with that intersection of and logistics sort of a band. This is where, how do I know when I'm going to need to intersect with a teacher or a tutor or a peer, right? And so how is that calendared, and how do I use that? And then moving back over into the termination and continuance, right? This is where it ends. This is where, yes, I got it and I'm moving on, or no, I didn't get it. I need to come back to that and or maybe I'm not, right? I mean, maybe I get to where I get and I move into a different place, right? Those are all the considerations. So this model really does, it really does talk about learning experience design and planning for that, not for planning for teaching, because those are very, that's a distinction that needs to be understood. So this is constantly being tested and evolved, and the model is being used. There's a number of districts across the country. There's a lot of them that are using this to actually start designing the system and the learning experiences, and then adding that to knowledge of the stuff, right, and the systems that are supporting all of that. And so being a learner of that is going to be important. This is an example, and I want to share this because people always say, "Oh, what does it look like?" This is just a math lesson or experience within a course. You can see that in the scope area, you're checking the pacing guide, you're checking the scope and sequence, you're looking at the resources available, you're aligning it with standards, and you're hoping that your district has those priority standards already aligned, and that you have all of the bits and pieces of the framework that you need to have. And if not, you need to find those, but that's where you're starting to check that out, right? That's your first building block. And then you're mapping and you're curating ideas, and you're starting to consider, and in this example, the 50% of the kids are remote. That's a reality today, right? And so what are you going to do? And what is your map going to look like? And how do you ensure that everybody's moving and that you're creating personalization? In the design here, you're going into the courseware, you're selecting the right modules, and you're figuring out how to sequence all of those items so that the students can self-navigate and then create those flags for when an intervention is needed. And then you're implementing, right? Then you're what's the first step, and how do you kick this off? And what's the second step, and how do you monitor students so that you're actually watching them move through the experience in their own pace. And then in the logistics level, right? So the path is set. You already know how to kick them off into that path, and where are you then going to intersect, and where are those small groups going to live, and where does a whole group live, and how do you navigate and modulate between all of those? And then when you're done, the students who have made it to completed all of the proficiency steps to the end, where do they go now? And where does everybody else go? And how do you help people to move on? Because it's going to be like this. There's going to be levels all over the place. So that's just an example, because that's sometimes helpful as we visualize these things. So that's the model, and it's kind of a lot of information to sort of lay down at one point. And I'm mindful that there's a lot of work that goes underneath that. And there's a lot of work that is necessary in terms of sort of convening the various groups within a system to implement something like this, and to actually sit back and say, okay, guys, in the executive team, we've got some new responsibilities, and we've got to say, we've got some help from the Learning Council. We've got a set of standards that have been developed. They've been developed with educators just like ourselves. We know that we're moving in this direction. We know we've gained this ground, or we have not, or we've got these challenges or barriers or misunderstandings or whatever, right? We've got things that we're working with. How do we now strategically think about this? We're heading into we're in the fall, right? But the year is going to blaze by. We're going to be starting to head into some of those planning stages as systems, and checking in on strategic plans and checking progress toward those things, and all of our SIP conversations are happening. This is a great time to step back and start to say, all right, here's a layer, a lens that we can use with which to see the work that we're doing, and some help in terms of knowing if we're heading in the right direction. So these are all available. On this screen, you can see that all of these things are available in the EduJedi and the Learning Council website. And so I very much encourage you to take a look at those. I am available at any point to have further deeper discussions on how you might want to implement those standards and how you might get a group of executives together to start breaking those down and showing how they apply. That's definitely work that the Learning Council and the EduJedi can assist with. So what we're really talking about is responsibilities. And so new responsibilities around learning design, we have those. New responsibilities for administrators, teachers, and learners around technology and around the use of that. The highlight on all of those, I would say, and the reason that learning design is number one is because it's number one. And that's the thing that we are all about, whether you're an administrator or whether you're in facilities, whether you're driving a bus or you're doing whatever that may or may not be seen or perceived as being teaching and learning, you're still about learning and you're still about teaching and learning because it's our job. And learning design is one of those things that we can't downplay and we can't highlight enough. And so I'd like to I'm going to pause here because I've been throwing a lot of information out, but I want to pause to see if anybody has some thoughts about how this is impacting their current work, or how this reflects some reality in their world, because that's what we want to hear. And it'd be great to have that dialogue.
Yeah, there's a lot to discuss here. And I think what we're coming down to right now and what we've seen in all of the EduJedi meetings that have been held so far this year, Chris, is that most school districts nationwide are realizing, kind of like Virginia Beach was just talking about, a device strategy alone is not really a strategy, it's a tactic. And after you start pushing all your teachers into your learning management system or even get one, right? There's a lot of places that didn't have one. And you start to inventory the bajillions of apps that have, popped up all over the landscape. You realize you've entered a new world. And that world is now the district's distribution of learning is sitting on a tech backbone, not just a teacher distribution pattern. And it changes the navigation for the student and the teacher. And it brings about these new responsibilities. So what we're thinking is happening right now is everyone is in that sort of messy inventory world trying to develop these pathways. And they're about to go into a heavy consideration of all these responsibilities for the navigational side. The user interface, user experience is hard. And if they don't start thinking about this, they just end up with still running against two dynamics, which is they're trying to be buildings and grades and classes, and then they're trying to be online at the same time. And those are two different organizations. So they either do this, they go, let's have an online thing over here, and then let's just go back to normal, which doesn't work. They lose kids that way. It's the melding of the two in between and the sophistication of the mixology that is the next discipline for all administrators. Mm-hmm. So everything you just talked about is a hardcore truth. It is the hardest part. And the fact that we're telling people, hey, you're going to do the really hard part now. I know, we don't want to turn people off, but,
sure.
The fact is you have to get everyone thinking about these responsibilities. So I'd like to ask anyone who's on the line right now to pop in and, make some comments about this. I know learning.com is on the line right now, and I know they've addressed some of these issues at the learner level. So Patrick, if you want to unmute, you can maybe talk about that. If you've been listening to this whole thing, I don't know if you've been working again in the background, but I'm going to allow you to talk. Patrick, if you want to pop on and talk about kind of what you guys have been addressing with regards to all of this.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, well, we've really been addressing the basic fundamentals of computer fundamentals. Like the Virginia Beach folks were talking a lot about all the digital resources that are coming into the schools and are in the schools and investing in. But what I'm finding watching my wife teach is that a lot of these students, they're not digital natives, as you brought up earlier too. So you need to really understand, learn their way around the keyboard, They need to learn about digital safety. They need to learn about cyberbullying. They need to learn, how to create a capital letter, how to, shift and really, we talk about digital equity a lot at learning.com, and it's having the devices is one, it's having the connectivity is two. And that's been hard with remote learning. But the third one is actually having those digital literacy skills for students to succeed. Most of our assessments are online now, right? In schools, starting even in second grade. And a lot of the students, they don't just have the basic computer fundamental skills to drag and drop and to realize that there's 2 pages or 3 pages to an exam or a test where they have to scroll or tab over. So there's been a big digital divide that we think that remote learning and some of the hybrid learning has really uncovered recently.
Yeah, and it has to do with what you were just talking about. It's the connection between where the resources are and that student's mental understanding of navigation. It's right where you can lose people.
And the other big thing, just I'll add one more point, is, and even at home with the parents, a lot of the parents really aren't digital natives. We think they are, but they don't have computers at home, and they might have cell phones or iPads, and the students, they can learn how to play games and they can post on Snapchat and other things, but they don't have that knowledge, so they're not getting the help at home, whereas a parent can read a book to a student. So there's a big gap developing there too, and what's going on at home with in a digital world with what's going on at school too. So that's another big piece of the equity part.
So if I could just jump in on that same conversation, I think those are great points. I think it's definitely not something that comes naturally, and even as a teacher, how are you mindful of all that? How do you know your kids well enough to know who may or may not have the proficiency, but then also the resources that you choose, the higher the sophistication level, in a lot of times the better the experience is, right? And so you don't necessarily have to have proficiency in moving around some very basic systems and jumping back and forth between individual apps, because then what you're talking about is an immersive experience, and that's important. I think as we start building and supporting designs for learning, that those higher sophistication level resources are being used, and that we're mindful of that in the mapping of our experiences, for sure.
Yeah, there's a whole mixology going on. So thank you, Patrick. I put up the digital learning experience standards. Some of them are on the screen right now for the learner level, but I'm going to call on Dr. DeVries about her comment in this, and then we'll talk more about these individual learner standards, because this is a thing now, right? There's new responsibilities for them beyond what we've seen before. Go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, I think, part of the responsibility, there's a fiscal responsibility, right? That's also accompanies this, is that you're using your money wisely and you're getting what you need out of it. And so we really did not have a way to track that. Sometimes we felt like we were just throwing a whole bunch, and the more money we get because of COVID, you have to be very careful and purposeful about what you're purchasing, what your purpose is, how you're integrating it into curriculum. I heard Chris talk a lot about, where are you in that sequence? Where are you mapping out where you're going to fit your small group instruction and where you're going to fit, and how do all of these interfaces and all of these digital tools enhance those pieces of instruction that are also important that have to fit together. And so, we have tools, digital tools now. There's a digital tool for everything, for small group instruction, for personalized instruction, for intervention, for this and that and the other. And we have a lot. And so we've just implemented, and it really doesn't matter what system you implement, it's the meaning behind it. But we've implemented a system called Catch-On, which captures all of our data. And it's kind of like that scope, right? It shows us what our scope is of division and school purchased resources. We are able in Virginia Beach, if a school wants to purchase a resource, they can't just go out and purchase it on their own. They have to get approval. So it comes through a couple of different approval pathways. First is our Department of Technology to make sure it meshes with all of our systems and all of that stuff. But then it also comes through us so that we can look at it through an instructional lens and say, yeah, this is a good use of your money, or it's not, it's of high quality, or it's not, or we already have 3 things that do the same thing, and let us help you, let us support you and teach you how to use those tools. So this system allows us to see all of that. But what it's done for us is allowed us to, or it's enabled us to have these, more rich and more frequent conversations around what are we using, what's working, what's not, what was the purpose of it. So if we have a digital tool that we've purchased that's an application and we were supposed to use it for providing personalized learning pathways for mathematics, let's say, how are our students accelerating in that? Are teachers even opening it up and using it with students? Are they using it as effectively as they could be? So that helps us have conversations at the building levels as well with principals and with teachers. So it's been really powerful.
Yeah, but hearing it as an outsider, and you're not the only school to talk to us about this, is what I'm hearing is this long stretched out moment of vetting this and going back and forth and what, da, 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 da. And it looks like a little bit like a war zone, right? Like it's like, and then, so you're telling people don't use it. If you're going to buy, you have to go through us. Well, they're probably, and tell me if I'm right about this, they're probably out there doing free stuff all over the place that isn't vetted. And that's like maddening because, they're putting 7-year-old kid data, where you live live in outside apps, and that's dangerous. Are you seeing any of that kind of behavior?
Yeah, I think, it goes back to digital citizenship, like the other guest was talking about. Not just with students, but also with teachers, is teaching them how to vet themselves so that when they're going out there and looking for, especially as we go, Virginia has a big Go Open initiative that's connected to the National Go Open initiative. And we are, really, I would say, knee deep now in OERs and things like that. And that's all wonderful, but you have to very carefully vet for quality for those things.
Yeah.
And if teachers are going to be doing that on their own, they have to have the skill set to do it. And so we focus a lot of our time. As I said, we're lucky we have instructional technology specialists that serve as instructional coaches. That's their role in the building. And they work a lot with teachers on how do you do that, because there's a lot of stuff out there and not all of it is of high quality. So you want to make sure you're, getting what's best for students.
Yeah,
So
I've seen that in a couple of districts where they have actually throttled in the very beginning, throttled the ability to add applications to student devices. And it's not because you want to own that, because that's just a lot of work as well. But there's not a lot of other ways for you to control as a system, control how stuff is used. And if we care about student data, which we do, then sorry, this is the process. And until there's another solution that's better, this is what we got to go with. Sorry.
What it really feels like to me is that when most districts went digital, they went into a lettingness, like everybody on your own, go do it. And a lot of superintendents believed everything was free on the internet anyway, and they weren't going to have to buy textbooks and just go figure it all out on your own. And then we had superintendents calling us. I got teachers in my office crying. They couldn't get it all done over the summer. Like, what do we do? But that lettingness was not apparent in the textbook days. I mean, we all remember the days when it was top down. This is your curriculum. You use this. And then teachers be like, well, I'm only going to use the first 3 chapters, and then I'm going to do my own stuff, and I'm going to supplement with History Channel videos, and I'm going to do that. And that was fine, right? The add-ons and the personalization by the teacher of the thing, but there was always a core thing. In most instances, there was a thing there, right? And then that all went away. And then it was like the Wild West. And it feels like now we're coming full circle, and most districts are telling us, we're going to be top down. We're going to devise the pathway, and you're going to just augment. And we're still in that middle area where it's like, well, we gave you an LMS, you figure it out, you build it all. Well, they're not instructional designers. Like 99% of teachers have not been trained in instructional design. That's why the EduJedi have been talking about this new design theory, because, you know, you're not only not in instructional design from the get-go, but this is digital instructional design. This is a new discipline, right? This is totally new. So we're in this moment where I think a lot of management is going to be taking control back, and they're going to be saying, we're building the pathway. I mean, we just had a Nashville district tell us, you know, they moved most of their instructional technologists to design in the last year. Like they're designing the pathways. So teachers didn't have to do that because they were already like, you know, trying to be in front of kids all the time via video. So this is a maddening moment for a lot of people, but I feel like we're going through like this, you know, I'm sure you feel that way, right, Nicole?
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, I think that Virginia Beach has always had pretty tight control anyway on, you know, but as a large school division, you can't control everything. And so there's always going to be a little bit of that unknown of what's happening out there in terms of what teachers are accessing. But like you said, if you're building a pathway for them, and that's what our learning management system has helped us do so nicely, and honestly couldn't have come at a better time, because who knew that we were going to need it as, you know, as much as we needed it once remote learning came along. But even teaching teachers that pathway of how to effectively utilize something like a learning management system, where you're giving them curriculum and they're looking at it, they're pulling in what they feel like they need. And that's kind of, not that it's a difference. We always provided curriculum and told teachers, you have a lot of options here, pull in what you want, you know, and what your students need, what you feel your students need. You ultimately have control and are the decision maker in your classroom. But it makes it more easily with the digital component now that everything's digitized. And so you take exactly what you want from the digital curriculum and you pull it over and you push out what your students need. And that is very powerful in a lot of respects, and effective for students, especially when you're talking about student-centered and personalized learning. But it also gives teachers, to some degree, a sense of responsibility to now make sure that they understand how to design things that they weren't necessarily designing before.
And I find, you know, it's a mindset shift to be able to do that. And I, you know, I talk to colleagues who have been teaching for many years and very successfully. And what's interesting is that once they jump in and do this, they're never going back. And everyone that I talk to who is successful says, wow, this was a lot of work, but I will never go back. I'm not going back. This is awesome. And yeah, it hurts for a while, but it has to be done. And as I think about the scope of this work, this is gigantic, right? We're asking the world to turn upside down. And we're asking people to focus on practice in a brand new way. And that's very uncomfortable for a lot of folks.
That's why we've had so many retirements, people opting out, people overwhelmed, saying, I'm not doing it anymore. And then there's a teacher shortage. So it's a moment.
Yes.
I want to talk a little bit about the rest of these learner level standards, because I think these are revolutionaries. Because when you look at your responsibility as an individual, one of the things that happened during the pandemic is a spike in student agency. Everyone figured, and being in parent agency and grandparent agency, like everybody got into it, is there are responsibilities. So this first one was responsibility for being the correct level in the courseware, right? So there's a lot of courseware in play, not just the flat digitized things that teachers do with the LMS. It's like, go log in over, they put the instructions in the LMS, right? Go log into your right module and blah, blah, blah. So there's new responsibilities for the students. They're like, what level am I on? Blah, where, you know, am I in the right place? Like just that, right? Like there's no just wait till the bell rings and get up out of your seat and go to the next class. It's not simple anymore. And then there's the taking responsibility for doing the adequate amount of practice, requesting additional materials if you're not sufficiently challenged. This is a whole new level to student agency. So Patrick talked a little bit about the student citizenship. The EduJedi took this deeper, right? They said, let's go beyond citizenship, which is proper behavior mostly, and knowledge about like how things work. And let's get into like, hey, so now you're responsible for you. And that's a whole different level. In fact, schools have been telling us they even have parent camps over the summer because they're putting agency on parents as well. But this one right here, number 6, keeps organized digital folders and labels and tags any files for easy recovery. Teachers don't even do that, right? You go into a lot of LMSs and it's still siloed. It's not tagged correctly. So the EduJedi held a whole meeting about how we're going to put out a protocol in the next reference guide on proper tagging, because there should be a standard method nationwide on how you tag things. Because if we don't do that, you leave one school and you go to another one as a teacher, you're lost again. But also because the sharing is so minimized when you're not doing that correctly. And now we're living in a world of unbelievable collaboration. So we need that kind of a thing to happen. So you can just see some of these other ones: maintaining a clean device, respectfully using audio enhancement. I mean, I've been on airplanes where people have the audio, they're not using headphones and they're watching a movie or listening to their phone. It's ridiculous. Like there's some rules. Like, so anyway, there's a lot here for districts to discover. I'll let you guys comment. Go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, it takes me back to our transformational learning days, which is still, kind of drives everything that we do in Virginia Beach. But the whole purpose of our transformational learning initiative was to build student agency. And how do we do that before we even get to the digital component? Because these things are so important and discrete, right? They're so very specific. And so just things like, so how do you, before you can respectfully use digital group forums for feedback and favoring, how do you know how to communicate and collaborate in a respectful way, with respectful tone, with respect? So we created those dispositions, with the student being one of them, and really at the center of all of our work. And that's so reflected in what I see here.
That's good.
And there's so many, and there's so much crossover, and there's so much transfer, right? So, if you want students to respectfully use digital forums and feedback and favoring, you have to teach them not only how to do that in the digital realm, but how to do that in life as well, right? So it really ties right in, and I'm probably getting way off on a tangent, but to all of our SEL that I know is so big across the country, all of our SEL efforts around building these skills and dispositions in students to be able to do these things and have strong social emotional behaviors and characteristics, like how to appropriately collaborate and communicate with one another. Because if you can't do that in real life, you're certainly not going to have those skills to be able to do it in the digital sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah. That I love that you said that, because that's the crux of the whole thing, right? Because that goes back to, as you said, before even any of the technology is layered on, that's what we're talking about, right? And so that's pushing on people's practice in a way that is more aggressive now than ever, right? And so for us to be able to understand what is student agency and how do we build a system that supports it and grows positive learner identity, that how do we do that? Because that's foundational. Mm-hmm. That's before all the other stuff, because none of that other stuff is going to work until you can get that stuff nailed. And that's worthy work. That's a worthy task.
And for truly transformational use of digital technology, I mean, rather than it being of low level, use, you have to have those pieces in place. I mean, you can't expect a student to do anything beyond fill in a digital PDF worksheet if they're not taught how to effectively collaborate and communicate and goal set and reflect and provide feedback in a respectful manner and all of that stuff, because you have such high quality digital tools that allow for that to happen in open spaces beyond just the classroom environment now, which can be dangerous if they don't know how to use it properly.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, this
Agreed.
has been great conversation. I'm going to do a more detailed breakdown of the hybrid logistics project, which the EduJedi have also been and continue to be heavily involved in, and it's just exploding right now. So I want everybody to know all about that.